All right. Um, I'm 3 minutes late. I apologize for that. And not that it's probably a huge problem because seriously, nobody's here yet. So that means nobody's really looking for it. Today, I titled the video Forgiveness because we've been looking at this week at times, the days after the resurrection, things that Jesus did post resurrection, things that we kind of don't really look at very often. We don't really think of it in the timeline. We just kind of put everything together because we're so much past the time that Jesus was on earth anyway. So it's kind of all muddled together, kind of whatever. But it does make a difference, I think. Wow, that's the internet's really kind of slow right now. But it does make a difference, I think, for pre or post resurrection and crucifixion, Easter weekend kind of stuff for Jesus, um, and just what he's talking about. And we don't have a lot of stories, but we do have a few. And today we're going to look at John chapter 21. It's the restoration of Peter. For more detail on this, Pastor Dan has announced that he's going to be preaching on this on Sunday morning. So if you really want more, there are 30 plus minutes on it. Specifically, obviously, watch Sunday. And I would highly recommend that you come to church online if you don't already do so. Anyways, whether he's preaching on John 21 or not. But my first question, and now there are two of you on here, is Matthew chapter 28. Before we get to that John 21 thing, Matthew chapter 28 has the Great Commission. Many of you are probably familiar with this, and with the two people that are on here, hopefully you have chat ability. When does Jesus tell the disciples the Great Commission? When does he say that to them? Now, there's a little discrepancy here, but I just want to throw this out here, something that I realized very recently from reading Matthew chapter 28. So, real quick, think about that. If you can chat, answer the question over here. When on the timeline does Jesus tell them the Great Commission? Because for me, I've always thought that he basically said that and then floated up or flew to heaven. Like as he ascended, he was maybe saying this to them. That is probably not the case. Matthew chapter 28 says in verse 16 is the Great Commission. I'm sorry, that is. Yeah, sorry. Starting in verse 16, says, Then the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some of them doubted. Jesus came and told his disciples, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. Be sure of this, I am always with you, even to the end of the age. So, if you disconnect verse 17 from 18, like if you say verse 17 and 18, there's a time period difference there, that it's not the same conversation, then you can say that the Great Commission was not said here. But in verse 16, it says, Then the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And that means that they were in Galilee, not in Jerusalem, where he ascended on the Mount of Olives. That is very clear from Acts chapter 1, that he clearly was having a meal with the disciples. He goes out, they go to the Mount of Olives, and then he blesses them and then ascends. This, all right, thank you, Natalie. Natalie just says that she's not going to be able to come anymore to live because she has online classes. Is that a problem for everybody? Because we can just switch up the time. So let me know that if that's a thing, via Facebook, Snapchat, whatever. Let me know if there's a better time for these devotionals. Noon just always seemed kind of like you'll be up and moving and everything. But anyways, getting back to what I was going to say. Sorry about that, Natalie. Hopefully yes, please watch them later. So he says, he obviously ascends in Jerusalem at the Mount of Olives, which is in Bethany, and Galilee is nowhere close to that. That's in the north. That's where Jesus grew up, Galilee, where most of these disciples are from. And so it says in verse 16 that he tells them to go to a specific mountain. They go there, and so they're theoretically in Galilee when he says this to them, which tells me a couple of things. Seventh graders now have math meetings. Well, that sounds pretty amazing, I guess. At least they're doing something. That's good. Do not skip those. Just looking at Matthew again, another thing that strikes me off of these two verses here is that one, they worship him, and then it also says that some of them doubted. So clearly, Jesus is teaching them. He has these moments with them that he's like, "Hey, we have some more teaching to do," and there's these specific moments. He did not walk with them. He beamed over, I guess, or whatever. Did however he travels. He traveled to Galilee ahead of them. They go to the mountain where they meet him. They see him. They worship him, and then some of them doubted. Up until this point, obviously Jesus is who he is, but they might have thought of him as more of one of the guys. They may not have directly worshipped him or something in that regards, but here they do. And so it's one of those things where, people like to think or say or try to get you to believe that Jesus never truly said he was God or whatever, or that people who really didn't believe he was God, that he was just a really good teacher or whatever. No, 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 no. He, in fact, is God, and his disciples knew that and worshiped him as such. You only worship God. You don't worship anything other than God. So when it says that they worshiped him, it clearly is an indication that, yep, we are to worship you. And then he teaches them, and potentially one of those things is the Great Commission, was part of that. It also does say that some of them doubted. And you do pick up on this at various places throughout this post-resurrection time, that they had some weird like, is this really Jesus? Is this really happening? Am I hallucinating? Whatever. They had some questions. They had some doubts. Thomas had his doubts at one point, and it says that in John chapter 21, which we're going to read in a second, that they didn't dare ask him who he was because they knew it was him. Why would you even? I mean, do you ever question, like, if you go up to, like, my friend Brian, who may be watching this? I never walk up to him and think, should I ask him if it's really him? No, I obviously know it's him. So just the indication there that they're thinking, like, maybe, man, I don't dare ask him because we know it's him. Like, there is obviously some disconnect right now going on. They have not fully understood maybe everything that's happening, but they're trying, and that's the key. And they're all going to get there eventually. But they do worship him in Matthew 28. It says there. But anyways, let's look at John chapter 21. Forgiveness. We need forgiveness. This is one of those great passages. I'm just going to read let's just read from the beginning, I guess, and we'll stop partway through. Chapter 21 of John, verse 1 says, "Later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee." So this is where they're up in Galilee. They're at the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus appears to them. And I believe at some point it says that this is the third specific time that he has appeared to the 12, these disciples. And this is how it happened, it says. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel from Cana, Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples. So I think that's seven. 7 of the 12 disciples are there. Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." "We'll come too," they all said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. I'm sorry. He called out, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" I really hope Jesus said that. "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. Then he said, "Throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll get some." So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, and by the way, the disciple Jesus loved is a reference to John, "It is the Lord," or "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, just the outer garment. He just took his coat off. No, doesn't get weird there. Jumped into the water and headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them: fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. "Bring some of the fish you've just caught," Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. "Now come and have some breakfast," Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. This was the third time Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he had been raised from the dead. And then we're going to let me stop there at verse 14 before we read verse 15, and just simply make a comment that Jesus is having breakfast with these guys. And I think one of the main reasons why he's doing this is to convince them, yeah, I'm real. Ghosts don't eat fish or breakfast. And obviously, it's another amazing one of those things. Jesus is making them breakfast. Like it's just one of those out of this world moments. It's also an allusion probably back to when Jesus initially called the disciples, and he's not calling them again, all of them. He is calling Peter again, though. This is the restoration of Peter, and I'm going to get to it in a sec. Well, let me just say it now, I guess. In Peter's mind, he has failed Jesus so miserably that he's no longer worthy to be one of his disciples. That's how remember, we didn't read through it, but I hope you understand that Peter denied knowing Jesus at Jesus' weakest moment. When Jesus had been arrested and was standing before his enemies, he needed his friends, and instead of standing next to him, his friend, Peter, denied even knowing him to strangers, people that he should not care about their opinion at all. And yet Peter denies even knowing Jesus at that point. It's ridiculous that he did this. And obviously for Peter, it haunted him, especially up to this point, and maybe haunted him forever, for the rest of his life. That he was a motivator for him to remember, I gotta show my loyalty or trust in the Lord even more now than ever, because there was that moment of weakness that I failed him like no other. And so there's some other passages that we could connect the dots here, but basically Peter feels like he's out, like he's probably, I mean, he is excited that Jesus is alive. He jumps out of the boat, he swims to shore, doesn't wait for the boat. He wants to see his Savior as soon as possible. But at the same time, he feels unworthy, and I'm going to have to go back to fishing because I'm a total failure. That's how he feels. That's where he is right now. And so Jesus calls him over and says, hey, I got some breakfast for you guys. You want to sit around and let's chit chat. Let's talk. And I really wish I knew what that conversation was. Someday when we go to heaven and there's the multiplex movie theaters, I can't wait to see the Bible alive. I hope it's more like I get to kind of experience it. I get to be there with them watching what the conversation was, because I can't. Can you imagine just the relief that Jesus has and all of the disciples, how serious just a few days ago had been in Jerusalem, and now they're sitting at the Sea of Galilee back home eating breakfast together, and just how amazing that would have been. And so at some point we're gonna read from verse 15 down here, because this is the restoration of Peter. It's very important. It's vital for us to know this information, because it's a encouragement to us when we fail. God does not give up on us. And I think that from the reading of it, it's not back to back to back. Jesus doesn't ask these three questions: do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Immediately after one another. I think this is a longer conversation, and he kind of spans it out, maybe over an hour, maybe longer, where he just randomly will say, Peter, do you love me? And so let's read that in John chapter 21, starting in verse 15. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question. Again, I don't think it's immediately, but I could be wrong on that. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said. You know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. And a third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And just stop there. We're told here that Peter's dad's name was John. So if he had a last name, which they don't back then, he'd be Simon Johnson or Peter Johnson. It's kind of, I don't know, in the English too, because this is obviously a translation of his name. But anyways, moving on. It says that Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself, went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, follow me. Peter turned around and saw behind them the disciple Jesus loved, the one who had leaned over to Jesus during the supper, and Lord, Lord, who will betray you? Jesus asked Peter asked Jesus, "What about him, Lord?" Jesus replied, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" Um, and so just looking at this, and that last time, it seems like they're walking, and like he's like looks behind him, and he says, "What about that guy?" And then Jesus says, "Don't worry about him. Worry about yourself." But you see what Jesus does here for Peter. Peter is in a moment of, I am a total failure. Couldn't have done anything worse than what I just did by just a few days prior, denying even knowing Jesus at his weakest. And Jesus then asks him three different times. Maybe that has a relation to how many times Peter denies him. "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" Jesus doesn't ask, "Did you love me?" He says, "Do you love me?" Peter doesn't say, "I did love you." He says, "I do love you." That's where Peter is, not where Peter was. And Jesus is pointing out that fact to him, that it's not, I mean, yeah, you screwed up. And he doesn't say it quite, I mean, obviously we don't. Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, you screwed up three times, so I'm doing this three times." You can probably hear the nonverbals right there, that you do love me, Peter. And yes, I do know that you love me. And that's what matters, is that Peter does love Jesus, does desire, in a sense, to worship, and that he sees Jesus as his God. So when we screw up royally after the fact, we're thinking about how guilty we feel, and we're thinking about how God may never use me again, and that I can never get over this hill, this hurdle that's now in front of me because of that huge sin. The question you ought to ask yourself is, do you still love God? Do you love Jesus? Doesn't matter. And I mean, it does, but it's not, did you love Jesus? It's, do you love Jesus? And if you do, as this example right here seems to indicate, that God has still got plans for you, still working with you, and is going to continue to use you. If you're still alive and you're a follower of Jesus, God's got a plan for you. And it is interesting that one other thing quickly from this, besides the forgiveness, which is the huge big part of this, obviously, that Jesus restores to Peter this moment, is that he talks about Peter's death, and he says that you used to be able to do what you wanted, and someday you're going to do things that you don't want to do. And Peter, we understand from tradition, was crucified. And verse 19, Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. I don't think that's figurative speech that John writes there, that Peter's death would glorify God. Even in death, like you might say, they're taken too early if it's a young person who died. I'm sure Peter wasn't a super old person when he was crucified, and just oftentimes we think of death as just this passing of somebody, that they just when we do ask God, why did this happen? What is happening here? I would say that there is an indication, at least for followers of Jesus Christ, such as Peter, that their death, while painful, while a huge loss. I mean, can you imagine the loss that Peter is, his death for the current church, or the church back in the day when he was alive in Rome and all that stuff? I mean, imagine, that's a huge loss. But his death still glorified God. As bloody as I mean, tradition says that he was crucified in the circus, Nero's circus or whatever. And you can go today where supposedly that happened, and it was out of sport for Nero, but for God, it was to give God glory through that death. And that even in our deaths, we can give God glory. And it's just an amazing thing, again, that our entire lives should be to give God glory from the beginning to the end. Even in our deaths, we should be giving God glory. And maybe I'm hammering this a little too hard, but for me, when I first read that the other day, as I was kind of getting ready for today's devotional time, and that just kind of stuck out at me, that Jesus was indicating that Peter's death would glorify God, and that's a. So anyways, some quick things, I guess, about updates about some stuff. Number one, thanks for everybody who came to the virtual youth group last night. I do ask that you would get the word out that we would do that. We could do that again. The connection, the link was on the Facebook page for the youth group. I also put it in the comment section of yesterday's video. So please know that next Wednesday at 6 o'clock, we're going to try that again. We had a bit of a Devo time. There wasn't enough people to probably play a game, so we did not play Empires. That's still out there, pending. Also, I was just told by Pastor Dan, one of the reasons why I was a little late, I was chit-chatting with him and lost track of time, but today might be the day that the governor gives an announcement. So today, sometime this afternoon, maybe tomorrow, there's going to be an announcement. The thing that you can do about that announcement, not just wait for it, but pray about it. Pray that God's will be done, and that whatever that decision is, that we would be willing to accept whatever that is, okay? And that we would figure out that it's not just about killing time to whatever. You have to live your life. New normal, but you still got to live your life. And the other thing, to the 3 or so people that are on right now, and hopefully more that will watch later, I really want to come back to youth group strong. So I really want that maybe the first youth group that we have as a youth group that we can come back together as a, at the Legion Hall or whatever. I want to do it right. I want to do it big. I need some advice. I need some tips from you people. What are some ways that we could do this big? Like best food? Should Alex sing like 12 songs? Don't think he's going to do that, but what is it that we need to be doing so that when we come back, it's a huge celebration? Because we've been gone for a long time, and I wanna do it right. And so let me know. Give me some ideas out there, and I'll try to make those things happen. We can maybe even rent an inflatable. I don't know how much an inflatable costs, but maybe we'll even get some, we're gonna do this big. Okay, that's all I'm saying. With that, we're already at 20 minutes. Sorry for that. Tomorrow we're going to be probably looking at some feasts, how the feasts connect to Jesus and point to Jesus. So with that, hopefully, Natalie, your class is going well. I don't know if you're still on here or not, but hopefully going forward, your math class goes well. I hope you're all doing some classwork, because school is important. You need to educate yourself. And with that, I'll be praying for you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow. And stay classy.